first off, I think throughout the history of AI, there has been something that has always been true, which is that controlling for cost, a specialized model will always beat a general purpose model on a given specialized set of tasks. I've not seen any evidence that that is no longer true. I think you very well be right that we might get to a point where there are God models that are the best performing model at any possible task you give it. It'll be orders of magnitude more expensive at doing any of those tasks than a specialized model. I would bet that in 20 years, if ranking is still a problem that is really, really prevalent across everything, it's still specialized models that are doing ranking and not God models that were trained to do ranking. Because the cost of ranking and how many times you have to run that if you're Meta or someone else is so massive that you can't put an overpowered model there. So while it might be true that we do get to a point where there are God models, and that might be what everyone wants to use in the consumer space, I would note, by the way, that's still almost certainly a waste of money for most consumers as well. I would bet that 99.9% of consumer queries are actually perfectly satisfied by existing models at this point. Like, I think they're largely good enough for most things that a consumer wants to do. Like, the vast majority of consumers do not need reasoning for most of the tasks that they're gonna ask. If you're doing really complicated mathematical stuff, yeah, reasoning really matters. But like, we're gonna put basic reasoning back into inference by just training models on reasoning traces, and then you won't need this for a lot of things. I think there are a couple other truisms that I think are true. First off, I think open source is largely going to converge with closed source. I don't believe in the competitive advantages that I think people often make about the closed source models. I think the data flywheels are absolutely useful. I don't think they're going to be a massive differentiator for the majority of tasks. I also think, like I said, I think already the best open source models cover most of the use cases that you would need. I think if all model development froze as of today, and we were stuck with the existing models we had for the next 20 years, there would still be an insane amount of value to produce by just actually harnessing the existing models that we have. So that's one thing I would say about the models landscape. I think another big thing that we're seeing pretty consistently is that post-training is largely, especially RL, is largely revealing capabilities that were already baked into the pre-trained model. I think that you've now seen a number of papers over the last couple of weeks in this direction. RL with a single example can now get 40% increases in math performance, stuff like that. And then there was just a paper from Anthropic showing that an entirely different approach can do the same thing. Clearly, if you do the pre-training well, you end up with models that have immense capabilities that are not actually harnessed by the way we do mid-training, and that we need to use RL or something like that to actually extract that out. So I think that we're gonna see that there's actually a lot of latent capabilities in some of these models. And interestingly, like, some of the models are much better at extracting these capabilities than others. For example, the Quen models are much, much better at being post-trained than the Llama models are. And there are various reasons for why that is, but I think this is also going to be an increasingly important thing, actually thinking about when we build models, how do we actually build models so that the customization we want to do on them is as effective as possible. Similarly, I think that, for example, alignment is something that fundamentally has to be solved in pre-training. If you can align a model in post-training, you can unalign a model in post-training. If it's easy to put it into the model, it's easy to take it out of the model. If it's hard to put it into the model, it's hard to take it out of the model. Pretty straightforward thing. So long as we're doing alignment in post-training, you're always gonna have models that can be misaligned easily. If you bake that into the actual pre- and mid-training process, you end up with a model that actually can't be. I think the other thing that's really important is twofold. First off, I think that there is this belief that in order to build a frontier quality model, it has to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. That is just patently false at this point, I think. Personally, the DeepSeek number of $5.5 million to train V3, I think is 100% correct. Now, note, that's just the cost of compute. That's not the cost of R&D, that's not the cost of salaries, that's not the cost of the compute for all of the hyperparameter sweeps and ablations that they ran beforehand. That is the cost just of training that one model, right? But what that means is that if you know how to do everything when you start, you can get a frontier model for orders single-digit millions of dollars, and that's going to go down substantially over the coming years. This is something that does not have to be nearly so expensive for people, and I think that there's this view that it has to be incredibly expensive. That's only going to get cheaper and cheaper if you can get everything right on the first try. And that's a lot of why we exist, is that right now I think it's pretty easy, not easy, but it's fairly doable with existing tools to get training right on the first try. It's extremely difficult to get the data right on the first try. Increasingly one of the things that we're talking to our customers about is by working with us, we'll make sure that you do get it right on the first try, which brings that cost. So I think that's another thing that's really important to consider is that cost is coming down quite a bit. Ultimately, we're going to be in a world where I think there are going to be many models that have different purposes, and there are times when it makes sense to use an open source model out of the box. There are times where it might make sense to use a closed source model, and there are going to be times where it makes sense to customize models. One thing I really like to see from a lot of the open source models is actually releasing intermediate checkpoints. I think this is one of the things we don't see from open source models that actually makes it harder to use open source models. Generally, the base checkpoint of most models is way too trained to actually do effective customization on. You generally need to customize a model from an intermediate checkpoint before it's been overtrained on the distribution that it's seen. So increasingly we find if you start from a llama final checkpoint, you actually don't get amazing customization out of it, whereas if you can get an intermediate checkpoint, which very few models have released, the only one I think that has released all its intermediate checkpoints is Olmo from the Allen Institute. But if you can do that, you can get much, much better customization. I think we're just really figuring out how to do this. So I think it's a big wide ecosystem. I think generally the right answer is to start with something that's easy to use and prototype with, which is generally going to be a closed model. It could be a simple open source model. You don't have to fine tune. And then as you start to see the product working, it then makes sense to invest more and more in building a customized model that can do that one thing for as low cost as possible, so that by the time you scale, you can now scale in a really effective and really cost-effective way.